Welcome, everybody, to the 2023 Vermont Organics Recycling Summit, organized by the Composting Association of Vermont in partnership with the Vermont Agency of Natural Resources. This year's summit is being held as a kickoff event for International Compost Awareness Week, which is the largest and most comprehensive education initiative of the composting industry. International Compost Awareness Week starts on May 7th. The theme for this year is for healthier soil, healthier food, compost. I just want to give a quick shout out to a program local here from the University of Vermont. The poster on the right is from one of the students in Dr. Deb Nair's Composting Ecology and Management class. And the full collection of these posters is showcased on the CAV website at compostingvermont.org/VORS. And each image includes the student's inspiration for the creation of their poster on the website. I'm Natasha Duarte, Director of the Composting Association of Vermont. And I'd like to also take a minute to thank our sponsors who allow us to put this program on free of charge for all of you for the entire week, which is fabulous. They include Community Bank, Eco Products, Nature Cycle, Vegware, Vermont Natural Ag Products, Addison County Solid Waste Management District, AgriLab Technologies, the Vermont Produce Program from the Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets, RMI, and the Vermont Sustainable Jobs Fund. This session is sponsored by AgriLab Technologies, so I'd like to invite Brian Giroux to unmute and share your camera if you'd like, and say a few words.
Thanks, Natasha. Looking forward to the sessions and good ones so far. Our company, AgriLab Technologies, is based in northern Vermont. Compost aeration and heat recovery systems are the things that are most unique that we do, and I think provide the most value. This is an example shown here of Tamerlane Farm in Lyndonville, Vermont. It's an on-farm composting site that also accepts food scraps and other biomass and residuals from the community. Our systems provide aeration, which accelerates the composting process, and they also have controls and sensors that allow us to guide and observe the process and adjust and optimize the process, and uniquely capture renewable thermal energy. This is one of the pieces of equipment that we make, those blowers, control panels, heat exchanger, and other timer controlled valves. In this case, it's being delivered to the Catlin farmstead down in Winchendon, Mass. So we provide these also in shipping containers and typically in increments of 4. So we're able to control 4, 8, or more zones or windrows of compost, negatively and positively aerating those piles in order to speed up the process. We now have installations as far away as Burton, Michigan, shown here, Country Oaks Landscape Supply, that's right next to Flint. So we're working with both farms, certainly got our start with dairy and livestock farms here in Vermont and New England and New York, but now also work with commercial facilities handling leaves, wood chips, food scraps, and a wide range of different feedstocks and residuals. One of the unique things about this site is, in addition to helping them process their compost on a small footprint and reduce odors challenges that they faced in their mixed commercial residential neighborhood, it also heats their nearby shop and sales building and a greenhouse that's used for vegetables and aquaculture. So you can learn more about our work at agrilabtech.com. Hope you enjoy this upcoming session. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Brian, and thanks to AgriLab Technologies for being a perennial sponsor of the summit. We couldn't do it without you.
You're welcome.
So we're going to move into today's session. This is the 1 p.m. session, Agriculture Food Residuals Management Insights on On-Farm Composting from the Vermont Agency of Agriculture, Farm and Markets. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and invite Zach to share his screen. We are joined today by 3 folks from the Vermont Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets, Zach Szczukowski, Steve Cash, and Stephanie Smith. And I'll let them do self-introductions a little bit more as they get going.
Thank you, Natasha. All right, well, thank you everybody for joining us on this call. My name is Zach Szczukowski. I'm an agricultural resource management specialist with the Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets, specifically the Public Health and Agricultural Resource Management Division. And I am accompanied by Steve Cash, who is the Inspection Program Supervisor for the Water Quality Division. And also on the call is Stephanie Smith, Deputy Director of the Farm Division. All right, so this is our session. We are doing agricultural food residual management insights on on-farm composting. Just to give a brief overview, we're just going to do a quick survey utilizing that raised hand tool that Natasha talked about just a few minutes ago. We're going to give an update, talk about some scope, siting and design briefly, and best management practices, as well as registration of soil amendment products. All right, just kick it off. If we could do a quick survey and get everyone on the call to raise a hand if you are currently a farm and accepting food residuals or food processing residuals for the production of composting. And we won't linger too long on this, but
Looks like a couple people anyway.
yeah, two. Yeah, wonderful.
And maybe more who haven't quite found that raise hand function.
Yeah, we can always fiddling through that's always fun. All right, get another raised hand if you raise or manage poultry.
Two people.
All right, there we go. Thank you. And the last question, do you sell compost? Perfect.
Another couple, three people.
All right. Thank you for that. Appreciate the participation there. All right, so just kick it off right forward. I want to give an update. So Act 41, which I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with, it was enacted in 2021. That law provides that the Agency of Agriculture can either adopt rules as part of the required agricultural practices or as independent rules under Chapter 218, which was also enacted as part of the Act. So after some internal discussions on this matter, the agency has elected to adopt rules for the management of food residuals and food processing residuals under the required agricultural practices. And it's the agency's belief that this decision will create programmatic consistency, as the required agricultural practices are the primary regulatory authority for farming activities. It's also the belief of the agency that this will ultimately result in a more efficient and cohesive program in the long term for both the agency and the regulated community. Given that, the timeline for amending the RAPs is still uncertain, and the agency is currently navigating statutory changes with council to plan for the long term, while also trying to meet the legislative intent of the Act. All right, got that ahead out of the way. Moving forward, so I just want to talk about some scope, and that's regarding the scope of kind of the law. Just to start, I just wanted to give a brief kind of overview of the required agricultural practices. So the agency regulates farms and farming, and the agricultural practices that are outlined in the required agricultural practices rule, the RAPs. Some specific practices which are regulated under the RAPs that are currently within the rule include the importation of 1,000 cubic yards of food processing residuals, as well as the storage of agricultural waste. And respectively, those are 6.09, and 6.02, I believe. In addition, generic, the RAPs encourage management practices to build soil health, including the use of compost application to increase organic matter. All right. So, like I said, alluded to earlier, Act 41, 2021, it amended the definition of farming in Act 250 to include, as you know, I'm sure a lot of people on this call are aware, the importation of 2,000 cubic yards per year or less of food residuals or food processing residuals onto a farm for the production of compost, and either the compost is principally used on the farm where it's produced, or the compost is produced on a small farm that raises or manages poultry. All right, so breaking this down, we got a few component parts and terms that I kind of just wanted to go over. So food residual, what is a food residual? A food residual, per definition, is source separated and uncontaminated material that is derived from processing or discarding of food and that is recyclable or compostable. The food residual may include pre-consumer and post-consumer food scraps. And then food processing residual, and that is defined as the remaining organic material from a food processing plant and may include whey and other dairy, cheese making, and ice cream residuals or residuals from any food manufacturing process, excluding livestock or poultry slaughtering and rendering operations. Food processing residual does not include food residuals from markets, groceries, or restaurants. Next component that I kind of wanted to touch on here that are relevant is onto a farm. So you're importing this material where? Onto a farm. What is a farm? A farm is a parcel or parcels of land owned, leased, or managed by a person devoted primarily to farming that meets the threshold criteria and the RAPs for being regulated by VAAFM, the Agency of Agriculture. And production of compost. So you got to be producing compost. Compost means a stable humus-like material produced by the controlled biological decomposition of organic matter through active management, which shall not mean sewage, septage, or materials derived from sewage or septage. All right, so here's the and component. So it's that piece and then and these two things next. The compost is principally used on the farm where it's produced. You got to be doing all the aforementioned activities within those definitions, and principally used in this context means more than 50%, either by volume or weight of the compost produced on the farm, and that it's physically and permanently incorporated into the native soils on the farm as a soil enhancement and is not removed or sold at any time thereafter. Another piece here is the or, so you can either be doing that or the compost is produced on a small farm that raises or manages poultry. What does that mean? Roughly, that means that the farm raises or manages at least the number of poultry provided for in the RAPs. My understanding is that it's roughly 100 chickens or the other types of poultry, if those are what the type of, that's what's going on. Ducks, etc. I don't know anyone doing that. Briefly, citing and design. This is not definitive, but what we can say is that an on-farm compost operation should not be cited within, and this is per the law as it sits right now, a downtown, village center, new town center, neighborhood development area, or growth center designated, unless the municipality has expressly allowed composting in the designated area under the municipal zoning or subdivision bylaws or an improved municipal plan. Additionally, it cannot be cited, generally speaking, in a flood hazard area or river corridor protection area. Design. Regarding design, generally, and Steve, feel free to jump in and add any additional thoughts you might have on this, but generally speaking, an on-farm compost operation should be designed to prevent discharges off the site and into surface or groundwaters. It's through the use of, could be runoff, leachate collection systems, diversion, or other management strategies. Additionally, the operation should be designed to accommodate the volume of food residuals and additional inputs to achieve composting. All right, just go over some best management practices. So compost inputs. As a general, there's concern always of contamination. So, it's just important to be cognizant that materials imported onto a farm for composting, and whether or not you're selling or using that material on farm, that such materials, they may contain unexpected and unwanted contaminants. Such contaminants can either be chemical, that can include persistent herbicides, per and polyfluorinated substances, PFAS, which is a hot topic of late, or they may contain physical contaminants, non-compostable debris, microplastics, various other contaminant or components that are just not degradable in the composting process. Operators are encouraged to inspect the materials, and obviously difficulty removing chemical through visual inspection, but remove any physical contaminants as much as possible. A key in this process is to understand where your inputs come from, and it's really important that on-farm compost operators are in communication with haulers and generators and educating them about contamination and maintaining a consistent dialogue with both haulers and generators in order to reduce contamination that's being brought onto a farm. With regard to permissible inputs, obviously food and food processing residuals within the bounds, those definitions, clean high carbon bulking agents, which is largely A&R has a list of that, waste silage, leaf and yard waste, livestock feed, various other things as well. It's pretty standard here regarding the compost recipe. I think everyone has, at least20 operators should have a recipe, within the following parameters. That's the classic C/N ratio of 20 to 1 to 40 to 1, ideal range being 25 to 1 to 30 to 1. Moisture content 50 to 60%, with the ideal range being 55 to 60%. Bulk density up to 1,200 pounds per cubic yard. The ideal parameters being around 700 to 1,000 pounds per cubic yard. With regard to pH, it's good to have a pH in the range of 6 to 8 SU. Additionally, operators are encouraged to utilize a compost recipe calculator in developing their recipes. And then lastly, due to contamination concerns, it is the agency's recommendation that food or food processing residuals not exceed 20% or 1/5 parts of a recipe calculation. And willing to have further discussions about that recommendation. General practices, incorporation, control of odors. It's important to incorporate materials into the compost mix within 24 hours of arrival, or immediately put the materials in a sealed container, secured to prevent unauthorized access, and then ultimately incorporate into the compost mix within 72 hours of arrival at the operation. Alternatively, third option would be immediately cover the food or food processing residuals with 2 to 12 inches of odor absorbent materials, finished compost, untreated wood chip shavings, incorporated into compost mix in 72 hours. Another tool in this is for managing odors would be using a cap, such as lining or rather. Treatment. So there's the classic process to further reduce pathogens, PFRP. Obviously, it's extremely important that anyone doing composting meet PFRP standards. And there's various ways you can do this, but at the most basic, the compost pile is mixed or managed in order to ensure that all the compost inputs heat to the minimum of 131 degrees Fahrenheit for the minimum time. That's could be different for turn windrows or rather ASP, but at its basic level, this kind of captures the PFRP standard. All right, additional best management practices, understanding and mitigating risks. Just to start, operators are highly encouraged to acquire certification from a compost operator training program. I know the Agency of Natural Resources has a list of approved programs. Generally, there's I don't know for certain whether or not we're gonna kind of maintain that same approved list, but the ANR does have an operator training course in the fall, I believe, once a year, if not twice a year. And it's a good opportunity, as well as various other providers of certification and training. And that's just one step. And if you get certified, you're just going to be much more capable of managing risk and managing a compost operation. Another component is a management plan. So use of a management plan can help operators and employees of that operation, one, ensure consistent practices and standards are met, but also to better prevent and manage risks. And those plans, it's important to update them as I'm sure everybody is aware, if you are actively involved in composting, that it's somewhat of an ever-evolving process, it seems like. So things change, things tweaks, you figure it out, you stay updated. Another important thing in mitigating risk is establishing a system for recording activities, composting activities, metrics. This can be done, temperature logs, ensuring those PFRP standards are met. What materials are imported onto the farm, the sources of that material, dates of that material. If you're going to look back in time and try to decipher, if contamination does occur, you want to know where that came from and how long that's been there on your farm, as well as quantities. Record keeping is also important for recipes. That's just fairly basic, and well, if you're using a compost calculator, then that also helps. So as part of a management plan, you could have a contamination response. So it's important that operators have response actions for any reception of contaminated loads of food or food processing residuals. Such response actions could include disposing the material at a solid waste facility, pretty easy. Communicating the contamination issue to the generator or hauler, that's always important. Refusing a reception due to excessive contamination, and kind of your processes for doing so. And where contamination issues become chronic, then those issues ought to be referred to the Agency of Natural Resources. Another kind of risks that are prevalent is weed seeds and other contaminants. So finished compost is the kind of concern here, obviously, is because Active composting, generally my understanding is it does kill any weed seeds viability, as well as cocoons. In this instance, the concern is jumping worms is often another hot topic debate. So there's a possibility that finished compost can become contaminated with either weed seeds or other invasive species, such as jumping worms. With regard to jumping worms, certain preventative actions might include, one, following standard compost treatment methodology, as it is my understanding that it does kill the cocoons. Maintaining a reasonable distance between compost inputs and finished compost, as well as, using, in one instance, separate equipment for handling pre and post active composting materials, or alternatively, as that's, if it's a large operation, that would be quite expensive. Alternatively, you can thoroughly clean the equipment if you're using the equipment for both managing the pre-active composting materials and the post-active composting materials. Another concern, generally speaking, and this list was obtained from the folks at the agency's animal health division. So avian influenza virus, it's commonly spread to domestic poultry by infected waterfowl. It can either occur through direct contact or contact with their droppings. While waterfowl can carry the disease without becoming sick, the virus is generally fatal for domestic poultry. Some of these risks obviously include poultry kept outside, ponds or other waterfowl attractions on the farm, piles of debris located close to poultry areas, introduction of poultry from other farms without a quarantine period, lack of personal protective equipment, such as dedicated coveralls and boots for working among poultry, and sharing of equipment between farms. Another concern is an operation that also manages swine on the property should design their operation in a manner which excludes any swine from consuming any imported food or food processing residuals that have come in contact with meat or meat-related products. While I'm not the animal health expert, I believe that is a hard line on their end. Another thing could be included in a management plan is addressing fires or spontaneous combustion fires, and that noting that certain conditions, such as high biological activity, low moisture content, or poor moisture distribution, as well as larger, more insulated piles, can result in certain instances these spontaneous combustion fires. So preventative actions could include increasing moisture content, reducing the amount of energy-rich inputs in the recipe, creating smaller piles at the outset, and routine temperature monitoring. In the event such a fire does take place, it's important to break down the piles into smaller piles and then drench with water. Testing. So testing it's important. Testing finished compost can provide essential data that the operators can use to better assess processes and manage risk. And if you're principally applying on site, this can certainly better enable the farmer to better assess appropriate agronomic rates of application. And if you're distributing, testing is required to establish a guaranteed analysis. That analysis, I believe, is nitrogen, phosphorus, and potash. In addition, Vermont law prohibits the distribution of an adulterated soil amendments, and that's under Chapter 20. Just briefly touch on registration of products. So all finished compost prior to marketing and distribution for sale must meet the requirements of 6 VSA Chapter 28 and the Vermont Fertilizer and Lime regulations, and that including registration, labeling, testing, and as aforementioned, prohibitions against adulteration. And for more information on registering compost products, you can contact AGR Feed Seed Fert at vermont.gov. All right, now we can open it up to questions.
Thanks, Zach. A couple questions did come in, and we'll start with those, but just a reminder that folks who have questions or want to have a point of discussion you want to bring up, feel free to go ahead and put that in chat while we're starting with the questions that already came in. So one question is, does the definition of on-farm compost operation and where it can be located or not located preclude urban farm composting?
An on-farm compost operation is not defined in statute. What is defined in statute is that a farm, a parcel of land owned, leased, or managed that is primarily devoted to farming and which meets the requirements of the required agricultural practices. I can't, definitively say it excludes urban composting, but that's an interesting question because
I think is there a requirement or a prohibition for like in downtown areas? Wasn't that
right?
Something I wonder if that's what that question is getting at a little bit.
I can jump in.
Sure.
Here's Stephanie. Hi, everyone.
Hi.
I'm with the Agency of Agriculture, and as Natasha had mentioned, I am the Deputy Director within the Public Health and Agricultural Resource Management Division. And it is true under Vermont law in Chapter 218 and Act 41, I don't believe it's session law, I believe it's actually in the chapter, that there is a prohibition on creating a composting facility on a farm in accordance with that, that definition that Zach reviewed earlier, importing up to 2,000 cubic yards, having chickens. But that doesn't mean necessarily like the facts of the particular situation matter. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you would be an individual would be precluded from composting in an urban area. There are it just might not be farming, number one. So I do believe, and I actually don't know if the exemption in ANR's laws, their 42 cubic yards of importing, would apply in this scenario. It just wouldn't be considered quote unquote farming under the definition in the RAPs and in Act 250. So there's that. And it certainly doesn't preclude a homeowner from composting their own, waste, food residuals on their own property. It just the scale, I think, and the relationship to farming in these designated areas, which are programs actually administered by the Agency of Commerce and Community Development. So that's a lot of information, and the facts matter and the location matters. But we could certainly dig in if there is a particular question that was posed, it's from, I believe, Brenda. So we could dig in on it a little bit if needed, and, in a conversation with you directly.
Yeah, and I'll just add, if I can, that there are also individual town zoning situations that also come into play. So this is actually, whether it's like gardening / farming in a community farm setting may not hit those, the volume triggers that you were mentioning, Stephanie. But then there's also these zoning, like every town has its own zoning nuances, and so there's all kinds of things that actually need to be taken into account. But I don't know that it's like Brenda, like overall precluded, no one's saying that it can't happen anywhere, but there's nuance, like Stephanie indicated, that needs to be just taken into account, and scale being certainly one of the big ones. Another question that came in from Deb was about the lists of inputs for composting And livestock feed was listed as an input. So what about livestock manure or bedding? I don't think those were listed explicitly in the slide or mentioned, Zach.
Steve Cash, yeah, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe those would be permissible, and that would be agricultural waste is what that the umbrella that covers those materials, right? Like manure on farm is an agricultural waste, correct?
Yeah, that's correct. And I think those would be permissible for use in compost. And that list was not intended to be an exhaustive list. It was just kind of a brief rundown of some things that would be appropriate.
And in fact, composting manures is a really effective way of better managing those materials.
Yep.
So Carolyn says there's an opt-in opportunity for municipalities on this one within a downtown, village center, near town center, neighborhood development area, or growth center designated under 24 VSA chapter 76A, unless the municipality has expressly allowed composting in the designated area under the municipal zoning or subdivision bylaws or in an approved municipal plan. And thanks. So that's just I think that was one of the specific questions. Thanks for quoting that, Carolyn. So that gets exactly to what we were saying was, the Agency of Agriculture may think that it's fine, but if your town zoning rules say not here, thank you, that's something that would need to be negotiated, and either an exemption or different location would need to be found. So another person says, Megan from Renewal Compost in New Hampshire, the legislation started to allow for us to process meat and dairy in New Hampshire 1 year ago. We're the first ever New Hampshire hauler who is also dumping and processing in New Hampshire. We're technically the permit holders for processing. However, the pile is not getting turned as frequently as you recommended, nor covered as rapidly as you recommended. Do you think this is okay? Or is it okay to let the compost pile turn slowly over time to finished product? So just to be clear, this is just asking for input on general best practices. This clearly is not asking Vermont regulators to weigh in on New Hampshire rules. But Steve, you look like you might want to jump in.
Yeah, what I would say on that is I'm reading through the chat to make sure I get all of it. I don't think you have to turn a pile exactly on a set time frame. It certainly will speed up the processes, but if there's not issues occurring, whether it's odors or vectors or things like that, I think a slower frequency could be all right. And then the coverage piece, I think I would say the same thing. If there isn't issues occurring, it may not be a big deal. If there's runoff or other issues occurring as a result of it not being covered appropriately, you'd want to take some steps to address, I would think. Zach, I don't know if you'd have anything else you'd want to add.
Temperatures, the recipe calculation, that's going to be important. Like the parameters of all the ones I suggested, if the moisture content's too high, or there's a multitude of factors that can go into, and I believe what I thought is the issue is that it might not be getting meeting the temperature requirements. What is it a turned windrow? Is it a static pile? Is it, what kind of system are you using? There's just a lot of questions or factors that are involved in maintaining the pile and achieving the treatment temperatures.
Stephanie, did you want to chime in, or I might just add a quick comment?
No, you can add.
Okay.
I'm all set.
Yeah, so, I would just bring it back, Megan, to the goal of, and what you're doing with the finished compost, because that's when different, like if you want to ensure or guarantee that it's free of weed seed, material will certainly compost in a slow and steady method. as Zach and Steve mentioned, you just don't want to be, causing any issues. So you don't want it to be so wet that leachate is running where it shouldn't, or, attracting animals or causing odor issues. But, if none of those are your problem and you're, way out somewhere and don't have neighbors and there's no, surface water around you, what you're doing might be just fine if you're not looking to turn turn over and finish that compost within a certain time frame, and you're not making any guarantees about it being free of weed seed or other pathogens. I would be a little bit concerned with and anyone else, this is just open discussion, I think, at this point. So if anyone else and the other participants want to chime in, but if you are taking meat and bones, there are some pathogen concerns that could creep in, but you can kind of address that either through temperature or through time. And so again, it depends on what your specific goals are. And I think any of us would be happy to talk with you a little bit more offline to get into some more of those details. So James asks, we're back to the where can people compost question, which is a good one because it is tricky and it's one that I have frequently. So I'm glad this is getting some airtime, I guess. So James says, with on-farm composting defined as an agricultural practice at the state level, so in Vermont, isn't it protected by right on any farms that are already zoned as agricultural? And so this gets into sort of how integrated is an on-farm composting activity to the act of composting or act of agriculture itself. Stephanie, you're leaning forward. Do you want to?
Yeah. I was just thinking, certainly because this is somewhat new, so farms in the state of Vermont, and Steve can probably also talk more about this, they have always had the opportunity to compost their mortalities, to compost their manure, to engage in composting on the farm. With this new provision that's in Act 41, we're talking about a specific activity of the importation of food residuals and food processing residuals for the purposes of composting. And so it's a little more nuanced than a farm composting. And if a property is zoned agricultural, it's likely not to be located in a designated downtown or a village center, or it might not be. It may be, but it might not be. But if you are, then this is not the opportunity for you to import food residuals because the law explicitly says, unless permitted by the town, as pointed out by Carolyn Gordon, unless allowed, this is not an opportunity for that. If it is a new activity, and I don't want to get in the right to farm law, the agency doesn't administer that. That's generally a private nuisance suit between people. But if it is a new activity on a farm, it is potential that anybody can sue anybody. No one's going to stop it. It's whether or not they're going to prevail in the suit. And that's a little different. So I just wanted to add those two comments. I don't know if my colleagues also want to chime in here.
Yeah, and we'll just give Steve or Zach an opportunity before moving to Carolyn.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add, Stephanie. I think that covers it.
Okay. Carolyn, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Natasha. Just wanted to add for the benefit of Zach that's the interesting thing about how the law works in general. Just because something is defined doesn't mean that the requirements will be beneficial in relationship to the definition. A definition is first and foremost just a definition. But whatever the requirements are in law define, okay, so what is exactly allowed, what is exactly not allowed. And here in this Act 41, 2021, we have not just the definition of what is now farming, we also have then, okay, but one of the requirements is not in downtown areas and so on and so forth, as we discussed. And that's in every law. Important to know that not just look how are things of the law defined, in law, but what are really the law's requirements attached to it. And as Stephanie also pointed to in terms of right to farm, when any farm that wants to diversify into farm, I think that law stranded in legislation this year, that it wasn't updated. So any farm that diversifies into a new practice, whatever it is, might not have the right to farm precedent on their side when they're creating a nuisance towards their neighbors that been there at the same time or earlier.
I'm sorry, that's Carolyn Gordon from rural Vermont. I don't think I fully introduced you. Thank you. And just, I think it's easy for us to think that farms are not in urban areas or downtown areas, but actually in a lot of towns in Vermont, downtown, like downtown is still pretty rural. And, I personally work with a couple farms that are like right at the junction of, it's as urban as Vermont gets, it's urban farming. And would meet that definition. And so these are just things that we will be negotiating, I think, as we work through the requirements and the rules. So we'll go to Stephanie and then Carolyn.
Yeah, I was just thinking, it's always a good, before you begin any activity, like it doesn't, like it can be anything that you want to do on your property. It doesn't necessarily have to be farming, like you want to build a deck. Or you want to compost on your farm. It's really important to ask questions in advance before you make an investment in your property to engage in that activity. There are a multitude of laws. It is very complex, unfortunately, I will say. And you don't want to make an investment. It could be an accessory on-farm business, which is a different law. I'm sorry to introduce that, but it's very complicated, and before you make the investment, make sure that you have the law behind you, you have the decisions in place for the permits or whatever the requirements are regarding that particular activity, so that you're not, getting in front of, your activity isn't in front of the law as opposed to being supported by the law, because it can be costly, and that's just not a good place to be, honestly. It's good to have your answers first. So I just wanted to share that, just general.
Thanks, Stephanie. Go ahead, Carolyn.
Thanks. I just wanted to follow up that when we advocated for the change in the law, the biggest discourse we had with lawmakers was around the question of nuisance from composting food residuals, because some of the pioneering farmers we've been working with had indeed really hefty issues with their neighbors around nuisance, because it happens that crows come and go to the pile and take stuff and carry it around and throw it on the neatly trimmed lawn of the neighbor who is maybe different in worldview than the farmer. And so this was sort of this provision we were discussing around municipal downtown areas that was sort of the compromise to even get this done. And I think we're happy that there's this opt-in thing in there, and we really hope that anyone who wants to do this locally, community composting in whichever setting, that if the local community is early on engaged, as we all suggested in the planning of such a significant project for a community service, then ideally the municipality would be on board, and it wouldn't be a problem that there's this provision in the law. That's our hope.
Yeah, and I'll just tag on to that to say that certainly if, or at least my understanding is that if you're importing less than that 42 cubic yards of food scraps to be mixed with other carbon materials and other materials, that is exempt. And I can do that, could do that, anyone could do that. But then really you do run, we do recommend and provide training around best management practices, just like you heard some here, because what triggers nuisance is not doing it necessarily as well as it could be, and having neighbors complain, and then having that to tease out what, is it a reasonable complaint or not. And so just like we're all saying, talking with your neighbors, getting folks on board. If it's not allowed in your downtown, but you get everybody in your neighborhood to sign on and think it's a great thing and they want to participate, and it's going to be at an appropriate scale, maybe that could lead to, to an allowance or an exception for that. So again, just that really open community transparency and communication is key at every turn, as along with just best practices for managing these feedstocks. James, go ahead.
So I just had a follow-up question regarding the zoning issue. So I guess like issues of downtown farms and nuisances aside, my understanding is that agricultural activities are generally viewed as allowed on agricultural zoned land in Vermont. And so I guess my question is the importation of food scraps as defined in the new law for composting or animal feed, is that protected on ag zone land just as a across the state, or is it more nuanced than that and it's going to be a town by town question? Because that, I think just to Stephanie's point, like, before you invest, you want to know that you like what, are you protected to be able to do this? And when it becomes a town by town question, it gets very complicated very quickly.
Yeah, do any of you want to chime in?
So
Mhm.
if the activity, so first it's a farm, there's a fair bit of analysis. It's even nuanced within our agency. So if it's a farm, it meets that definition. And if you are farming, which includes the 2,000 cubic yards or less, and or managing poultry, if you're going to sell the compost, then it would be considered farming. But it's largely based on the facts of the operation. So I don't want to say that you're good to go, because it's dependent upon the facts of the operation specifically for the agency to tell you if it's farming. So there's no general statement here. It's always nuanced.
I think presumably though, without, the qualification that, this is not my understanding is that, if this was considered, an operation was a farm, the land or property was zoned as farming, and this activity as defined, the importation of less than 2,000 cubic yards, that was also part of the farming activities occurring on the farm. So that's all part of the farm, all farming activities. Again, qualification, general understanding is that, the right to farm law might apply. Seems like it would. I'm not entirely certain, provided you meet all those qualifications there under, and I can't remember the section of law, but one being, meeting all applicable state, local regulatory and statutory laws.
Ben Gothier just put a link into the 6 VSA 5153 from Vermont Agency of Ag Food Residuals Composting Rules. Again, just the direct language that is in there that says explicitly initiating the production of compost from food residuals or food processing residuals onto the farm on or after July 1st, 2021, within a downtown, village center, near town center, neighborhood development area, or growth center designated under 24 VSA, Chapter 76A, unless the municipality has expressly allowed composting in those areas. But I think we've even read some of this. So basically, it prohibits this if it's new, and it's food scraps, right? So you may be on farm composting your field residuals and manures already, but if you're starting to bring food scraps onto your farm, that might be where there is a difference. So I think we're covering some of the same ground. We're going to go to Carolyn and then James.
Yeah, I'm not sure if James' hand is still up or up again, but I wanted to respond to his question about this now being part of the definition of agriculture and the general consequences of that. And another anecdote just from the advocacy for this law is exactly that was the intention and the goal of it, is that, you know, farms that were already practicing this said, we're now not protected as farms doing this anymore because it's not a defined agricultural practice. And we are being regulated by ANR as solid waste managers. And that really takes not just away from our farms status through that specific new permit that we need for Act 250, but it also takes away all those other regulatory consequences we're facing, not having the privileges that come with being recognized as farming with that practice. And so that was the whole idea of incorporating this practice into the definition of agriculture, so that those various bouquets of privileges in regulation apply to those farms who do this, with some of the caveats that we discussed.
Yeah. So thank you for all of this. I don't, you know, I think this is still one of those points where people read it and are either confused or come to their own conclusions about it. But I think the very bottom line is best to just double check before really, you know, going, you know, both feet in, so to speak, into this activity on your farm. Carolyn.
Well, I was just, thanks for the follow-up opportunity here. Wondering in terms of timeline, for the what was announced as rules to be adopted. Just if the agency could share any more details around what is the promised timeline, as the original legislative determined timeline is in the past at this time.
I do not have any updates as far as integrating these into the RAPs. I saw Stephanie was unmuting, so perhaps you have anything additional to share, but I just don't have that answer at the moment.
I was going to say the same thing.
But yeah, I mean, as soon as we have more information regarding you know, the rulemaking efforts on the required agricultural practices, the agency would absolutely be sure to communicate that.
Yeah, and I would just invite you to feel free to use the Composting Association of Vermont and this, you know, us as a network ally in terms of getting the message out when you're at that point. We're working with, you know, partners like Rural Vermont and NOFA and others who work with farmers, and I'm sure you're in touch with them directly as well. But you know, also, you know, a growing number of farmers are joining the Composting Association of Vermont and starting to get engaged, right? Which is one of the things we were hoping with this law, is that we could incentivize farmers to be part of the solutions in their communities. So in terms of organic diversion from landfill. So certainly happy to play that role. The other thing that I wanted to just let folks know, because it was, Zach did mention it, we do have on Friday morning a Jumping Worms panel that we're going to be going over best management practices and sort of covering like soup to nuts, like from composters and nurseries and garden centers, and we're developing and homeowners, farmers, you know, individual residents. And it is just an ongoing issue in our state. It's becoming more of an issue. So we're developing some new web pages with some resources and best practices for that as well. So stay tuned for that. Not seeing any other questions. I'd just like to thank participants for joining us today, and Zach, Steve, and Stephanie for the session and for sharing information from the agency's perspective. It's always good to get clarifying things. And even if you don't quite have all the answers that we're just chomping at the bit for, it's, I think, just this continued and iterative communication among us, among the agency and our community is really helpful. So I really appreciate the three of you taking the time.
Thank you, Natasha.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
Can I ask
Thanks, everybody.
another final question if we still have so much time?
Sure. Are you guys able to hang on? Sure. Go ahead, Carolyn.
I thought I had read in the workshop description that there will be also some sort of guidance on the issue, and I wonder if that's something that's going to be available through the agency's website prior to prospective rulemaking on the RIPs. So just so that people have something in the that they can have in the hand around this.
Well, we have so there is guidance to some extent that's outlined in the A&R small composting rules, as well as guidance generally that's outlined in the RAPs regarding the treatment of leachate and ensuring, distances from water bodies and whatnot. They're not the same in either of those documents. And I think Zach brought up at the beginning of his presentation that we're seeking a legal opinion about the application of the current environmental standards within the RAPs versus the application of A&R's small composting rules. And so we're at a bit of a point in time. However, if people wanted to develop a new site, obviously contact the agency so that we can talk to you about your activities and see if it falls under the definition of farming as outlined in the law. And then once you've done that and you've determined you're not in a downtown or a village center and your town otherwise does or doesn't allow, per the what's in the chat that both Ben and Carolyn put in there. So those are other requirements. You could apply the most restrictive requirements with respect to setbacks as a part of that operation. And then you would meet them holistically for both agencies. And then, of course, even if you met a setback, we were chatting earlier with Steve and Zach and I, and you notice that your pile tends to be wet, or your management plan is such that you might have greater leachate off your compost pile or your storage area. You can always engineer it or manage it or site it in a way that ensures that there is no movement of nutrients into surface water or groundwater. So designing and working with someone to ensure that that doesn't happen is probably the most important thing, regardless of any of the setbacks that are outlined in any of our rules. So, and I don't know if Steve wants to jump in or Zach wants to jump in on that question.
Yeah, I certainly have a lot of conversations with producers and agricultural operators and consistently remind them that the solutions and mitigation efforts that they may use on their property, they are probably going to be the best suited to know what they need to do to manage those situations. There are regulatory requirements, buffers, setbacks, but I always encourage operators to think about what will work for their site and how they can manage the situation to make sure that they don't have problems. Certainly things like, moisture levels, moisture content, slope, all of those things are things that should be taken into the planning process as somebody is considering undertaking any of these activities.
Great, thank you. And James.
So just in terms of folks doing due diligence to see if they're fitting into the definition of agriculture and are eligible for your program versus going through the Agency of Natural Resources, who's the primary contact with Agency of Ag for this?
So I think, James, the process it sounds like you're interested in is our farm determination process and trying to get an understanding of whether a particular operation is a farm that would be regulated by the RAPs or is not a farm that would be regulated by the RAPs. The agency does have a farm determination process on our website. That is specifically related to structures and building, which is regulated in Section 9 in the RAPs. For these types of farm determinations, I'd encourage you to get in touch directly with Zach rather than go through our online portal, just because the processes are similar, but they have different outcomes. So I don't know, Zach or Stephanie, if you'd offer anything different in that space.
Yeah, I mean, I'm also going to be working in concert with the Water Quality Division. So it'll be a multi-person effort in making such determinations. I also just wanted to say, believe this is James from 131. Thank you. I took your course and it was very instructive, so I appreciate it. But yeah, you can contact me and then I'll loop in other relevant members of the water quality.
Great. So Zach as the main point of contact for some of these questions. And if it doesn't end up being in your body of work, Zach, it sounds like you can then just refer people to who it is specifically they need to get in touch with.
We're all working on it together.
That's great. All right. And I certainly didn't mean to cut conversation off. So we do have a little bit of time left. Carolyn.
Yeah, and just to continue the discussion there, when I was asking for guidance, I was not literally meaning, can someone explain to me where people can find information or what information would be at this time helpful to people. Guidance is another legal term that describes a written document that the agency would publish on their website, where in letter form or in whatever written form, these things that we discussed today are all written down so that anyone who also did not participate here or who did not reach out to the agency yet or doesn't want to reach out to the agency yet can just simply go to the website and download a document where all these things are explained. And so I'm just taking home that at this point on this innovative practice that here over 40 participants had interest in, we neither have a rulemaking process launched as it was prescribed in law, and neither will we get written guidance.
Just to follow up on that, thank you, Carolyn. While, yes, we don't have written guidance currently at the agency, what we have are the RAPs, which are rules, and then we have the ANR's rules, which are rules that govern composting and or environmental standards and farming. I mean, it runs the gamut of what they cover between those two existing sets of rules. But I also want to make a plug for the fact that this is very nuanced. This is not as it's not easy for the agency to come up with guidance, unfortunately. And we encourage people to contact us so that we can have those interpersonal communications regarding site-specific issues, as well as what they would like to do. Maybe they want to start small, but maybe they want to grow. But and I'm not saying that we won't produce guidance or we're definitely going to go through rulemaking at some point. However, we don't have a timeline. But those conversations that can happen between the agency and a prospective farmer who is importing food residuals and or food processing residuals are really important conversations that the agency would like to have. And so while we do have a void, and I'm going to own that, we don't have guidance, we don't have rules at this point that are specific for food residual composting. I do want to invite participants to contact the agency and have the conversations with us. We are available and we want to help.
Yeah, and I'll just tag on to that, Stephanie. Thank you, and Carolyn, for also just that clarification that there are a number of other organizations that can also act as intermediaries, as we've already started doing. And I think some of what, just to add a little bit more texture to this conversation, some of what I've been hearing from farmers is just like this hesitance of like, well, there aren't rules and they want to start, but without rules and guidance, they don't want to start down one path, even if it's small scale, and then feel like the rug is pulled out from under them. And there is a little bit of PTSD perhaps around the whole chicken feeding situation and about faces. And I'm just going to put that out there. And I think that's part of where some of the hesitance is coming from and some of the requests for really specific written legal documentation that they can fall back on. And so that's just is what it is and where we're at. But I think that I appreciate just the open communication that we've been having and think that we can work together through this and come out to hopefully a point where farmers can really be incentivized and engaged to be part of the solution for composting and organics diversion in our state, especially in the rural areas where there are fewer options, honestly, and some of the other infrastructure is just not there. Even though we've made great strides. So, yeah, any, I guess that's my closing thought. Would you, the three of you, like to offer any final closing words, or anybody else? Again, I feel like I'm jumping a little bit. If there are other questions or conversations, we can certainly still have them, but folks are starting to sort of drop off the session, and we are coming up on time a little bit. So certainly welcome to have more conversation, or just if it's Zach, Stephanie, or Steve, if you want to have any closing thoughts that you'd like to add.
Yeah, I think I'll build on Stephanie's point a little bit, and then that can also include my closing thought. You know, I think we can own that we don't have rules and have not met those legislative timelines, but I also do hope that people really understand the complexity of this issue and bringing waste to farms. Zach mentioned PFAS and microplastics, and this is a challenging space. It doesn't have easy answers. And so I think, as Stephanie said, we'll continue to work at it. And I do think we can't get to space where we have those answers that folks want. It will just take some time. And I think my closing thought would just, I encourage any agricultural producer to always be aware of what you're bringing onto your property, and really ask your haulers, whoever is bringing that material to your property, just to be aware of what's in there and ask those questions. So that's my closing thought.
Thanks, Steve. Zach, anything you want to add? Or
Yeah, just thanks, Steve, as well, and to kind of reiterate those sentiments. But yeah, I'd just like to say thank you for your patience, to everyone who's trying to be involved in this. And by all means, like Stephanie said, reach out, and we'll try to navigate this together. So appreciate it.
Yeah. And yeah, Stephanie.
I just want to thank you for the opportunity for the agency to participate. And we like to get in front of folks. We like to share our faces and our names so that people know who to reach out to. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you. And the three of you, I would also, if you weren't able to participate in this morning's session about CAV's on-farm composting project, it's a very different model, and we very directly and relationally address contaminants in that, and are developing a lot of resources and working for farmers who are working with their communities. It's a very different model than, you folks just put their food scraps out at the end of their driveway, and they have a contract and someone takes it and they don't even know where. When farmers are engaging their CSA members or folks who are regular customers at a farmers market, it's a very different conversation and relationship that grows from that, and might be able to address some of the issues or the concerns about contaminants that the agency might have or be thinking about. And I'd be certainly, obviously a recording of that will be available after the summit, but I'd certainly be happy to speak with any of you at more depth at any time about that project and get you more engaged. And Stephanie is on our project steering committee for that project, so she's well aware also of what we're trying to promote as a community-based solution to this, and less that relies more on relationship than contracts, as a way of really navigating some of the trickier aspects of what is coming onto the farm. Because I think Steve, just to say explicitly, I think we all share your concern, right? Where, we want to see our ag lands and our graze lands protected from contaminants, whether it's PFAS or microplastics. And there are different pathways for that. And it doesn't necessarily have to mean no food residuals composting. It just might need to be a slightly different model of bringing food residuals and food scraps onto farm. And what does that look like? Yeah. Anything else? Any closing thoughts from our participants? Thank you so much to those of you who hung on. Carolyn.
Yeah, just my final thoughts. Thank you so much for doing the presentation here today. It was really enlightening, and I think we're all always happy these days when we can have in-person connections to clarify things, especially those that are really complicated and nuanced. And I just would probably leave it with an encouragement to the agency to put yourselves into those shoes who struggle with legal uncertainty when they do want to diversify in a meaningful way and do something positive for the community, and to go ahead and at least launch a website where your contact info is clearly front and center, or however you can do to proactively increase clarity around what are the current regulations in place, especially since what's even now in the RIPs is not even visible in the RIPs online because they haven't been changed to date. So that would be my closing thought.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Take care.